Welcome to my channel on the best of fantasy. Today I am reviewing The Darkness That Comes Before, the first book of the Prince of Nothing trilogy, which is also part of the second Apocalypse series by R. Scott Bakker. There will be no spoilers in this review. Now, based on the praise that I was hearing for Bakker's writing, I was expecting to discover one of the most talented writers in fantasy, and I did. His excellence shows in his prose, his exploration of theme, his portrayal of characters, and the creation of a world in crisis. That said, The Darkness That Comes Before is almost relentlessly bleak. One of the bleakest books I have read, and it is unflinching in its characterization of humanity, as well as the brutal patriarchal world of Earwa and the Three Seas. Now, let's start with the prose. Bakker's writing, his command of the written word, puts him among the very best that I have encountered in the fantasy genre, in literature in general. His writing is versatile enough to convey intensity during the action scenes, beauty and horror, and quieter moments of reflection. Such is his skill that despite the relatively long sections of characters alone with their thoughts and passages of exposition that many modern fantasy writers would avoid, I was never bored while reading The Darkness That Comes Before. Now, in terms of themes, there is just a lot packed into this book. There are a lot of, it's just great thematic work. You can tell that Bakker is a very thoughtful writer. One of the more prominent ones is identity, and I'm doing this without spoilers, but these themes are just marvelously woven in here. So identity, on the level of the personal and the cultural and the level of humanity, and how these different layers of identity interweave with one another. Also, the theme of identity and the self. What happens to the self during some traumatic event? Trauma has a way of changing the self. And who is this new person? Maybe changed beyond the point of recognition from the person that was there before. And then how does that new person fit into the culture, into the tribe, into the previous context in which that person might have been comfortable but no longer is? There is the theme of belonging, speaking of which, the theme of belonging. The themes of culture and tradition are just richly conveyed in here. And tradition often being an excuse for brutality. Brutality that isn't seen as brutality because it's normalized, because it's part of what we have always done. And so we don't see it for what it is, and often because we have otherized the victim of our brutality. Speaking of that, faith, not that faith is universally negative, sometimes it can have positive repercussions, but faith can also be a matter of sacrifice and gain. There is social hierarchy very much part of this narrative. And again, fitting in with the idea of tradition and what we excuse, the inhumanity that we excuse as part of tradition. Patriarchy is huge in here. This is a very bleak, difficult world to be in. Not my favorite place, nowhere you would want to go for a vacation, I'm pretty sure. It is a very patriarchal world. It is a world where a lot of bad things happen, particularly to women. And that is one of the harder aspects, I'll be honest with you, of this read so far, is that there's a lot of bad things happen to especially all the characters, but especially to the female characters. It is a world of the strong persecuting others, and it's pretty hard at times. And that is, I think, deliberate on Bakker's part. And of course, it's very important to note when discussing these things that inclusion is not the same thing as condoning these things. In fact, I would venture to say that Bakker is trying to explore patriarchy and oppression and its causes and its consequences in here. Of course, I have read only one book so far in this trilogy, so I am eager to see where he goes in these matters. And I suspect very strongly that he is going to be keen to portray the consequences on the characters who are most affected by the oppression and the patriarchy. Thus far, I am convinced by his writing that that is the case. What else is there? Oh my goodness, there's just so many great themes. Politics. Politics, there's some seriously backstabbing, Machiavellian kind of politics going on in here, where you have characters who are manipulating the larger social movements to their own ends. Very cynical types of characters. And it's not always very certain how much faith a person actually has and how much they're actually trying to aggrandize themselves. Sometimes it's more clear than others. It's just a lot of layers to what's happening in the context, which I'll talk about in a moment. But politics is huge in here. The manipulation of the masses, appearance versus reality, the nature of power, what are its effects. There's a lot in here that is very subversive. The myth of the hero, especially in a martial context, the celebrated warrior who conquers, and the worship of the hero as a consequence. What exactly are we giving up when we worship a hero? There's a lot in here about that theme. So there's just a lot packed in here, and I hope to discuss more of these in detail when I have a spoiler discussion with some friends later on. But for now, I will leave it at that. Now, I want to talk a bit about the characters as well, because I did find them very compelling, if difficult to relate to in some ways because of the pain they're going through and the suffering. So you don't exactly want to get too close to that, but relatable in that sense as well, because they are suffering. But the characters tend to be in this book either broken and pitiable, or sinister and manipulative and cynical. There's really not a lot of else going on. There's the oppressors and the victims in here for the most part, and so it's part of the bleakness. It's not exactly flattering to humanity, the cast of characters in here. Not that not that Bakker is inaccurate in certain respects, but it is not the most uplifting portrayal of humanity that you'll find. No one is exactly lovable, I think. And some of the characters are actually horrendous. So characters like Akamian, who is really, I'm pulling for the guy, but in some ways he is, kind of broken, and it's a bit difficult to get 100% behind somebody who feels very jaded. And then there's Kelhus, who is, if this were a different writer, maybe Kelhus would be the hero, but actually he's a bit scary and difficult to relate to, frightening, frankly, in his manipulation of others. This is where I feel like Bakker is playing around with the savior, that sort of trope. Maybe if he were more humanized, it would be easier to do the hero worship thing, but I don't think that's the point here. You have characters like Nair, okay? Think Conan, or for Malazan readers, you'll be familiar with Steven Erikson's version of Conan, Karsa. But think of a character who is raised in what the civilized cultures would call a barbaric culture. He has values that are kind of difficult for us to relate to. And sometimes things he does seem brutal and horrible and awful. In his culture would be seen as simply the way of the world. It's a very difficult character for me to read, frankly. He does some brutal, terrible things. At the same time, Bakker's skill is such that I found myself at times kind of on Nair's side, which was a strange feeling given some of the stuff he does. That just tells you about the skill of this author. And there's Xerius, who is an extremely manipulative, conniving, nasty emperor who is actually really skillfully portrayed. I mean, there's some great, there's a bit of comedy in here, a bit of humor. Bakker's humor tends to be very wry. You're not going to laugh out loud or that sort of thing, but you'll find yourself with a wry grin on your face at times. And a lot of those scenes are with this character, Xerius, the emperor, who is, he's an incredible piece of work, a very damaged individual, but extremely ambitious and manipulative. So ambition is in there a lot. And then, of course, his nephew as well, who is trying to fit into that hero narrative that I was talking about before, Confus. And then you have the female characters, and I've saved them for last because they were, in some ways, for me, the most difficult to read. this is, as I said, I already said, this is a very patriarchal, brutal world. And so you have Esmenet, who is a prostitute. And the word used most often for her is not the Latinate prostitute. It is the much more blunt, rude word whore that is used constantly for this woman. And she is a character. There are some awful scenes in here that involve Esmenet, who is used, obviously, by men. But there are some especially brutal scenes in here that, I found very difficult. And frankly, I hope to see the female characters gain some agency in the course of this trilogy. I hope that will happen. There are hints that might happen. But for the moment, Esmenet and the other female character, Serwe, who is, a concubine is the word they use for her, which is really, there's not a huge difference there. And she experiences similar trauma to Esmenet. Both of them are used and abused sexually and raped, and it's just, it's horrible stuff. And to see their reactions to that. I was speaking of broken characters, but I do hope that there will be some agency for these characters. But this is not the type of reading you do to make you feel happy. It is much more challenging. But as I said before, I think there is some purpose behind this, that Bakker is exploring stuff that is unfortunately part of the world we live in. And I think that can be important in literature sometimes. So yeah, the characters are just really effectively drawn, and I found them to be vivid, but at times difficult to sympathize with because of the tragedy that they suffer or inflict. So, and in terms of the world that these characters find themselves in, as I said, it's very brutal. There is a larger, epic spanning and mysterious element to this world that I'm not going to get into, obviously, in detail, but there's bigger stuff in the background. One thing that Bakker does very skillfully is he gives us a sense of the layers of history, the thousands of years before the present, that inform the present, that are very much part of the events of the present in ways that the characters don't even realize yet. Some characters, perhaps more than others, are onto it, but it is a very important part of this, the past and its weight and its influence on the present. But the immediate context is a holy war, and it is very much reminiscent of the Crusades in that sense. You have the added element of magic, because this is fantasy, where there are these schools of magic, which frankly are, I think, some of the coolest parts of Bakker's world building, and what he does with these various schools of magic. I really like what he does there. It's very much a soft magic sort of thing, where he doesn't really define it in depth yet, but nevertheless, you find the magic to be pretty awesome and cool and dangerous, but with its weaknesses as well. There are consequences to the magic in here. Some of them are very haunting, and I won't say too much because there'd be spoilers in that regard, but I think anyone who's read the book will know what I mean. There are, as I said before, it's very reminiscent of the Crusades, but you also have, I think, what the Nansur Empire reminds me of the most would be what we in the West call the Byzantine Empire, which is really the Eastern Roman Empire. The Roman Empire in its waning days, or its after its waning days, the remnants of it. And you have the Fanim, who we don't see as much of, but they seem very reminiscent in a way of Muslims during the European medieval times, during the Crusades and that sort of thing. So of the Middle East and Arabs, but also with added elements of magic. And you have these others, these barbarians. I mentioned Nair earlier. He's a pretty fair representative of one of these barbaric cultures, but in his case, they are somewhat reminiscent, perhaps, of the Mongols, the horse warriors from the east. And you have other kingdoms more reminiscent of perhaps Germanic barbarians and that sort of thing. So a pretty interesting blend, which is very much in a world that Bakker has obviously spent a lot of time creating, and it feels very compelling. Even if it doesn't feel like a place you really want to be in. It's a bit of a relief when you leave this world, actually. But I do very much look forward to continuing this trilogy. As much as I find it difficult reading and challenging, I find it to be very compelling and extremely well written. So I am looking forward to finishing up the Prince of Nothing trilogy and seeing where Bakker takes all of this. And if you can take the suffering and the pain, I think it would be a very, very transformative, important read for you. So that is it from me for now. Until next time.